All right.
Okay, why don't we get started? I'm Josh Cohen from the Economic and Trade Mission at the Israeli Embassy to the U.S. And on behalf of the Foreign Trade Administration of the Israeli Ministry of Economy, I'd like to welcome you to our special event, Cyber and the Development Agenda, an idea whose time has come. Just as very quick background, we put this together because Israel is very active in cybersecurity, and we cooperate closely with a number of development institutions, most specifically the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, on building cyber capacity in developing countries. We came up with the idea because more and more donors are kind of getting into cyber, and we thought it would be a great time for a public discussion on this subject. And the idea of the panel is to sort of have an open, healthy discussion, and then hopefully subsequently folks can kind of carry on offline. Couple of quick housekeeping comments. The event will run for 1 hour and we'll save about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&As. However, for those interested, either attendees or panelists, we are going to keep the program open as long as anyone is interested and available to talk. So we're not going to artificially shut it off if there's good questions and people are enjoying the dialogue. So with that said, let me introduce our distinguished moderator, Chris Painter, who helped me come up with the idea for this event. Chris is the president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise Foundation, which I think many of you know, the GFC, and is a wonderful initiative. He's the commissioner of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, and was the former Obama White House cyber director and coordinator for cyber issues at the State Department at the Assistant Secretary of State level. So Chris comes from a very deep background in this area, and we're very happy to have you as the moderator. Chris, over to you.
Great, thanks. And thank you all for joining us today. This is a very, I think, emerging and important topic. Obviously, as many people know, there have been an increasing spate of high-profile cyber events, cyber attacks, cyber intrusions in the United States and really around the world. And developed countries are not the only targets of those events. Developing countries are too. And I think the last year, the pandemic has shown us that every country is more and more dependent on digital technologies for everything they do. And I think that's going to continue into the future. And I think that's highlighted it even for developing countries. One of the things that I saw, and I think many saw in the UN recently, in a process called the Open-Ended Working Group, where all 193 countries of the UN came together, but also other stakeholders came together, was a number of countries in the developing world, but also in the developed world, raising the importance of cybersecurity capacity building, that was really a foundational element for all the other things they're trying to do, both in the digital agenda, but also in the security agenda, that if they're trying to have more prosperous economies, social growth, have a better security for their countries more generally, that capacity building was a key and often missing piece, because many of these countries didn't have either the wherewithal or the understanding of how to contact the right people. And to be frank, and this is something we'll discuss, compared to the larger development agenda, which also could use more resources, cybersecurity is often seen as a very boutique issue, and there are comparatively very little resources that are devoted to it, given the scope of the need. The organization that I help lead, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, which you can find more about at our website, thegfc.org, is an organization with over 60 countries, a couple dozen private sector members, civil society, about 130 members and partners in all, that is set up to coordinate cyber capacity building, cybersecurity capacity building around the world, and has tried to do that matchmaking function with countries who need help and donors and implementers who can do it, but also provide a number of other services. But that's relatively new. I mean, we're 6 years old now. A lot of the traditional development organizations have just recently really stepped up their attention on this. So what we want to do today is really discuss this issue, and we have a great group of panelists here with us. Yaron Rosen, who is the CEO of Toka, an Israeli firm, and I'll have each of our panelists introduce themselves right after I give their names. Roi Shaposhnuk, sorry, with the Israeli Air Force Industries subsidiary ELTA. Lior Tabansky, who is at Tel Aviv University's Blavatnik Interdisciplinary Cyber Institute. Stephen Burns, who is with the USAID, and Marl Williams, who's with the World Bank's Digital Development Project. And I'm going to ask each of them now just to give a short introduction to themselves, their organization, and sort of their connection to this issue. So why don't I just start with Yaron?
Hi, thanks, Chris. Honored to be here. Very simply, Toka, cyber capacity building company, like bullseye for this forum. I think we work with governments worldwide, government agencies, to build national level cyber capacities, both products and projects, directly and with partners such as the World Bank and IADB and others. I myself I was in the military until a little over 3 years ago, retired after over 3 decades. Last position, I was the chief of the IDF, Israel Defense Forces cyber staff. That's it.
Great.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Why don't we go next to Roi?
Hello, everybody. It's a great honor and privilege to attend this session. The name is Roi. I'm running the business development and marketing for IAI, Israeli Aerospace Industry, ELTA Cyber Division. One of our main activities that we are doing is deploying a national cyber footprint with countries around the world, mainly in Africa, in Latin America. In the last 2 years, we have established 6 different projects of establishing national cyber active directories in those countries as a national CERT and a national SOC. And I think this is a very important topics to discuss about the things that we are doing and how is it connecting to the world and the digital in the world.
Great. Lior?
Thank you, Chris. Great to be here. I'm Lior Tabansky from Tel Aviv University. In the last couple of years, I have led the research to develop a capability maturity model for sectors of societies rather than nations or firms. We have been working closely with a range of stakeholders, and we are now engaging with the World Bank in order to use the applied toolkit derived from this research to support their great and fantastic work around the world.
Great. And then I guess we'll go to Mark.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marl Williams. I'm the practice manager in charge of global knowledge and expertise within the digital development part of the World Bank. I've spent 20 years working in policy, economics, and regulation of the ICT sector. I recently joined the bank at the end of last year, but this is my second time here. I was with the bank with the same predecessor department between 2006 and 2011. And I'm responsible for the cyber agenda, the global cyber agenda within the World Bank. So leading our thinking and research and policy work on the issue.
Great, thanks, Mark. And finally, Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve Burns. I'm Chief of Energy and Infrastructure for the Europe and Eurasia Bureau at the U.S. Agency for International Development. For those who don't know us, the assistance arm of the U.S. government. The programs I manage cover primarily Eastern Europe, the former Soviet republics. I'm engaged more in cyber issues related to critical infrastructure protection. I think the agency writ large has been involved in cyber for quite some time, but more issues of election security. We've really started to broaden our digital development platform and so on. But I can speak to my bureau as a whole. I think we're on the forefront in terms of development in regard to bringing this into traditional donor programs on the critical infrastructure side. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, I hope I didn't miss anyone. I think I got everyone. So thank you for those introductions. Why don't we just dive in? So sort of set this up in the beginning. I'd like to get the various panelists' perspective on what's really the current status of cybersecurity in the larger development agenda. Are we still seeing resistance from either the donor or the traditional development community to this as a topic? I will preface that just by saying that often in the past, I've seen the development community look at cyber as something that's more a security or policing or military issue. And so there's been some reticence to take it on as a topic. I feel that's been changing, but I'd like to get the perspectives of folks here. Steve, let me start with you, just because I remember back when I was at State many years ago in 2011, when we launched an international strategy for cyberspace. Part of that was development, and I remember USAID then thinking about a strategy for cybersecurity, which I think was very forward leaning, but it didn't really get the traction at the time that it needed for various reasons. Have you sensed a change in that? What do you think the current status is from your organization?
I mean, that's a great question, and I think you're jumping right into it. Honestly, my perspective is that in talking to other donor colleagues, the issue of cybersecurity generally causes some discomfort for the exact reason you mentioned, right? It's about the development versus the defense space. And cyber is a little bit more difficult to consider in a development context. If you just bear with me for a second, I don't want to take the whole time in answering the one question, right? But the difficulty for donor agencies is we count things. We count number of people trained. We count number of laws done, infrastructure projects done, investment mobilized, and so on. And the difficulty when it comes to cybersecurity is how are you truly measuring your impact, right? You can't count crises averted. You can't count attacks avoided, right? So it leads to, I think, a little bit of soul searching on how you structure a program and garner for support for a problem that, while we all know is out there, isn't necessarily front and center until someone really truly gets hit, right? And so, I can speak just one final point there. I think, within at least the US context, more overtly, I'm not going to speak to other work, but in terms of development context for us, it took the substation attacks in Ukraine to really sort of garner some support and get more attention into the programming to really, I think, crystallize some of the issues in some of the more harder critical infrastructure type sectors.
Right. Well, Mark, from your perspective at the World Bank, I've observed that same dynamic in the past. There's been attention to the World Bank to these issues, but it's only been getting more attention recently. Can you sort of describe your sense of where this lands right now? And I also note that increasingly development agencies in other countries, like in the UK and the Netherlands and others, have been embracing this as an issue, whereas before they haven't. And so I know that's part of your larger uh, field or remit, as well as dealing with all these other countries. So could you give us a little sense of what the World Bank is saying?
Yeah, I would say the situation in terms of cybersecurity and its priority, where it is on the priority list in the development world, is in a very different place from where it was certainly 10 years ago. No question about that. I would describe it as a high priority high corporate priority within the World Bank, and I think that just is a reflection of, or is reflected in other donors and other governments, national governments, sets of priorities as well. I think there's probably two big trends that are driving that. One is the increased digitalization of life in developing countries, and the work that donors and governments are doing across all sectors, increasingly has a digital component in it, which it didn't previously. So that's one thing. So that then clearly creates more exposure to cyber risk in developing countries than would have been the case before that trend really took hold. And then the second thing is the sort of global attention around cybersecurity. So not directly, specifically affecting developing countries, but that heightened awareness of cyber risks around the world and all the different aspects of it, I think, is filtering into donors' thinking, and that's being reflected in their prioritization of work with developing countries.
Mark, is there a sense that cybersecurity is often seen as this area on its own, but increasingly, as you have control systems that are critical infrastructure, as Steve said, that are controlled by cyber, means that when a country is building out its water system, its power system, its food distribution system, that cyber and cybersecurity is something they should consider in those aspects, those more traditional development aspects?
So I think you're right. In historically, it's been seen as an activity on its own, on a standalone basis, and in the World Bank, historically, that's been led from the digital, people focusing on digital agenda. I would say that that view of cyber has changed quite significantly now, and the prioritization of cyber within the institution is, it's come from the senior management, and it's a sort of direction to the whole of the organization to make sure that they enhance their focus on cybersecurity. I mean, organizationally, that creates challenges, both national governments and donor institutions, because you're dealing with multiple different groups within the organization, also dealing with institutional complexity on the other side as well. But I think the way you described it, Chris, there is, definitely reflects the current thinking within the organization that this is a cross-sectoral priority.
I mean, it was interesting in this open-ended working group, there was a big push to get that, the language that the UN has, their major development goals. Cyber is not among them, but some people say it kind of cross-cuts among them. But there was an attempt to get language in there that said that, and that didn't make it in the final consensus report. In part, it was, this is all, looking at crystal balls or trying to figure out what happened. But in part, it was seen that some countries were afraid that if you mentioned cyber, it would take resources away from traditional development. But my sense is that that pot is pretty big, and integrating them doesn't really mean you're starving one child to feed the other. That you can have cyber as part of that. Has that been your experience, Mark, so far?
Well, I think we're midway through this transition in thinking, so it's a bit early days to see where it's going to land. But I mean, I think the way we should be heading as an organization, and in partnership with the countries we're working with, is that we see cyber as just an integral part of development in all of these sectors. So when we're thinking about energy, for example, we're not thinking of cyber as a separate issue. We're thinking of energy with cyber resilience built into it. And that's just an integral part of the project, the same way that, environmental protection is, and safety and other types of things. And I think, we want to head in that direction as an organization. It's difficult to say how far we are into that journey yet, but that's definitely where we want to be.
Great.
Can I jump in there really quick, if all right? So yeah, the point I would make is that, sometimes I think there tends to be this false dichotomy in how cyber is viewed, right? We at least through my programming are trying to incorporate it across what we do. And I don't even think at this point we refer to it as cybersecurity quite a bit. We look at it as more organizational reform and organizational planning. So we were effectively doing cybersecurity work 10 years ago when we were working with organizations on response plans for floods in Southeast Europe, right? When we were looking at critical utilities. It's emergency response preparedness, planning. It's emergency. Sorry, I'm losing my words, but it's basically emergency response. It's planning for and how do you address issues. It's just bringing in this digital element to it. So it's part of, I would say, what the donor playbook has been in terms of organizational reform for years. It's just a slightly different subject matter. That could be one way that you could frame the issue.
Great. Roy,
maybe another
nodding, so let's go to you.
Another issue, if I can jump in.
Oh yeah, Yaron, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add just another, maybe another perspective. You get paid to make nothing happen. That's how, going back to what you spoke about in the beginning. And it's really hard to grade how good you're doing, because when nothing happens, is it because something you did or something else? Now, in that sense, cybersecurity is not different from any other defense area. The thing is, why should global bodies or global donors invest locally in any country to build cyber resilience? Why is it anyone's business in any locality to work on this thing? And I think we should mention a few things. One, it's just impossible to ignore it. The damages on a global scale are just huge. That's the first thing. Second thing is the speed of development in cyberspace is just unlike any other domain. So this whole cyberspace thing is how old is this? Like 15, 20 years? And how many countries know really how to operate in cyberspace? Like a dozen countries or so. So who's going to teach the whole world how to do this? And when you look at the problem and what's at stake, every part of a nation worldwide is affected by cyberspace because it's part of how lives are. So the economies of states, the political infrastructure or government, the security apparatus naturally, and it's a global game, no more local. So everybody has, it's a collaborative defense game that we all have to play together. And that is why it's so important for donors to weigh in and help the weakest link, because you're strong as your weakest link.
Great, thanks. Roy, you were trying to say something as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to break down the cyber word, because we're all using cyber, and I think towards the years we came to realize that specifically in the developing countries, places that the technology is not that big, and yes, there is a huge demand to deploy technology. First of all, there is the part of the awareness and the education that needs to come above all of that. We looked and we saw that there is a very big demand from the governments to deploy systems and to deploy so many SOPs and elements and to protect the critical infrastructure. But at the end of the day, the lady that lives in the village has no idea what are the risks and what she can actually get involved by opening a link or damaging by using her phone. And I think that awareness is above all. And we have realized that sharing the information and sharing all the challenges that you have in the tools, in the machines, in the phones, in the laptops, iPad, tablets that you're using today are actually bigger than implementing only the technology. And we realize that today, to start with the very basic, let's say, first schools, and then high schools, and then to take it all the way to universities, that's the main element to do before we are going and running and starting to deploy those big words of cyber and tools and hardware and all of that. You're on mute, Chris.
Yeah, I know, Roy, that you're involved in, for instance, setting up training ranges for countries. And Yaron, you've been working with a number of countries in terms of implementing some of the capacity building. I'm just interested in both of your perspectives on what you're seeing out there. And then Lior, I want to go to you next after that to talk about your maturity model. But for the two sort of private sector implementers we have on the call, what is your perspective on what you're seeing on the ground?
Yeah, we have experience working with the World Bank and with the Inter-American Development Bank, working in Chile, Nigeria, Ghana, and Moldova recently. I think that it's apparent that these countries are in a very initial phase of understanding, governance models, like who needs to be responsible for what. And that's a very important step to assess the threats and then start building virtually an org chart, a national level org chart. And every country is a little bit different because it's in a different phase in its own development. The second thing usually that I see is working on building, the bodies, the big projects, whether it's a CERT or a SOC or, building the muscles, the national level muscles that you need. So that may be another type of project that we see. The third is what Roi mentioned is building the human capacity, which is really the long-term investment, which is much, much needed. And I always tell the governments that I talk to, and this is very relevant, and I think for donors, it is the most I would say beautiful, okay? I'll use that word because there's a real long-term impact on a country when you invest in cyber education, because it's not only about defense. These people, okay, that are accredited, they start, they start up the economy. The startup economies globally start from this. So it's not only about that. So there's a collateral, it's not collateral damage, it's collateral prize that you get from this investment. And the last thing which I see is investment in securing critical infrastructure. And we just did something, it looks so simple, but it's really not simple. Just now in Moldova, we led with the government and the World Bank a project to protect the government as a critical infrastructure because they were all working from home. So how the hell do you protect the government assets and people's information when everyone is working from their own device, right? So just thinking about the strategy, the architecture, the technology, the processes, it's a huge thing. So I think that's what I see.
Yeah, interestingly, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise is that we have 5 working groups. One's on strategies and policies, including training diplomats, but also just having national strategies. One's on incident response and critical infrastructure and building certs. One is on cybercrime. One is on skills and training and education and awareness. And one is on standards. So you can divide these different ways, but there's a pretty wide group of different issues. Roi, just in terms of your experience, what have you been seeing?
Yaron mentioned is quite right. I can give you an example of a project that we have done in Africa, and we identify that the gap between the technology-wise and the knowledge-wise is becoming bigger and bigger as the days goes by. So we have decided to implement, first of all, an academy to train the people on the very basic, we call it washing the hands philosophy. How do you actually deal with the normal awareness things, and how do you share the information? It was easier to run the first group of trainees and then to start implementing the technology once they understood what is actually the hidden agenda behind all of that. We understand that in the developing countries, the gap between the technology itself and all the things that we see, and in Israel, the startup nations, you have so many gadgets and so many things related to cyber on a daily basis. You still need to maintain the human element to build up the ecosystem and to make sure that it will be a system that will feed itself. We have done that. As I said, in one of our biggest clients in Africa, we have managed to secure today more than 1,000 students every 4 months that are actually coming out as ambassadors for cybersecurity. And then they are starting to implement it into their houses, to their jobs, to their facilities, to the kids, and you are increasing the level of the awareness over there, and it matches at the end of the day with the technology that you want to deploy.
Lior, I want to turn to you. I know that you've been working on essentially a cyber maturity model. So you've obviously been looking at what factors to include there, how to assess different countries. It seems to me that's often the prerequisite or the foundational thing you do before you really engage in capacity building, figure out where a country is and what their needs are. There are other maturity models out there. I know Oxford has one, and some other folks have had different indexes. How would this thing that you're putting together, how does this help get the development community more involved, or how could it help get the development community more involved?
Yeah. So we came to this work from perhaps a little bit different perspective than what I heard from my colleagues here. We do not think that cybersecurity is primarily a defense issue, but an enabler of digital transformation and so on. And then in parallel, we also think that the way we, the developed countries and the West are doing is also not perfect, let's put it mildly. So it is not about transferring some best practices or something like this to others and teaching them, but really taking a bottom-up approach to the problem, to the long-term sustainability of the work that is done and how we ensure that things will work in the future in the developing countries too. So our model looks at the sector. This is a main innovation. We leverage network science and system science to capture a sector of economy and to analyze it. And perhaps the most valuable component is that the assessment is just the beginning. We provide also recommendations, progression paths, how to help the specific sector to grow and mature and acquire better capabilities. The recommendations are project specific and not generic. We're not taking a NIST CSF or something like this for a standard, but we help analyze and then choose what not to do. You know, it's very easy to give recommendations what to do, but the essence of strategy is choosing what not to do. And we aspire and we validated the model in some ways that our recommendations are relatively clear to understand to the stakeholders and are based on the indicators that we assess. Now, when we talk about critical infrastructure, there's a very big overlap between sector thinking and critical infrastructure, because critical infrastructure really is a single firm or a set of isolated systems, but it's a much bigger system, so to speak. For example, the recent fashionable word in cybersecurity practice is supply chain and things like this. Yeah, but when you think in a systemic way, it is part of the scope of your analysis, and you can address this without creating an additional market niche or something like this. So the model is developed. Of course, it will undergo improvements. What we then did is through the connections that was established with the World Bank and others, we have worked out something that can be applied relatively easy. So the entire scope of the project should be about 2 months. It relies heavily on the information that we get from the subject matter experts who work in these countries. And it's a light burden. We rely very little on self-assessment of the people. We're not passing questionnaires back and forth. And I think these are the main points that will help. Now, the recommendation regarding cybersecurity, we do not derive them from some book of standards or from secret knowledge, but from the analysis of the specific sector. For example, you are improving water availability, then if there is zero ways in which cyber can hamper this goal, then there will be no recommendations. Some of them we will always find some, but cybersecurity is not the most important thing in the world, and certainly not in the top 20 priorities of the people who live, the citizens in these places who have much bigger things to worry about. And the development community does very important work to help. So this is our perspective. We try to plug into existing projects and then sort of prove the value of our concept and the toolkit that we have developed.
Thanks.
Can I build? Can I
Yeah,
build on this comment there? I'm so sorry to interrupt. I can't help.
I want people to jump in. So Steve,
I can only sit quiet for like 5-10 minutes at a time, and then it just start to jitter. So just to build on a point he had made there, the fact that the assessment's the beginning, right? And I think it was Roi that spoke to the human element. One thing, as donors, we really need to be sensitive to, and, sorry if I'm taking this, on a left turn a little bit, but it's the cultural context in which we're working. Okay. And so I think history is replete with donor projects and analyses that are nice and sit on the shelf and don't go anywhere, right? And so one of the challenges, I can speak to the programming I've been engaged in, is it's actually building the critical mass or the sense of urgency, or navigating the inherent cultural norms to actually move our counterparts towards action. Right? We have heads of agencies that don't feel empowered. We have regulatory agencies that don't come from a legal tradition where they are empowered to move forward without being directed by the central government. We have, right? So it's all of these issues that really need to be fully incorporated into a cyber program, as opposed to just looking at it as a technical issue or as a training issue. And so it's a long-term slog. It's not something that can, I think, be done on a single project. It's a multi-year, long-term, multi-sectoral project.
Yeah, look, I think there are a couple things that were raised.
Adding to that, Chris,
Yeah, go ahead, Roi.
Just one thing to what Steve said. This is one of the things that you can also see a very visible return of investment. Once you are doing the proper education, once you are giving the awareness, then you can start seeing those developing countries opening themselves to the outside world. Those students can see themselves as a future workers in the international companies such as Microsoft and so on, and that can contribute the economy of those countries. I agree with Steve 100%.
So a couple of issues were raised that I've seen. Certainly one, when doing a capacity building seminar, for instance, in the Pacific Islands, some of the countries said, look, we're glad there's attention on us and we need the attention, but there's not a lot of coordination. So like 12 different organizations want to tell us how to build a cert. We know how to do that. We know the 101, now move us to the 102 and other things. So that coordination is important. And that's something that my organization tries to do, is that level of coordination. The other is this issue of political will, that there may be people within governments who want this issue, but unless it's really driven at the leadership level and there's an understanding that cybersecurity is important, you're not going to get that. And that goes to this other issue, Mark, I want to turn to you on, is, to get that level of political will and to get that integration between the development and the cybersecurity community. I mean, one thing the World Bank has done is had a development fund where cyber projects were christened out of that fund. But more recently, the World Bank also has now set up, or some of the countries have set up, a cybersecurity fund. So I guess the question for you is, what is the answer? I mean, should this be treated as a separate issue, or should this be treated as integrated into the other development issues you're dealing with? Or is it a hybrid? Is it both?
No, I think it is both. If we think about, how to deal with cyber risk in development, it's got to touch on across, multiple areas of government and society. So some of the things that have been mentioned about, domestic use, you've got corporates, small and medium enterprises and big corporates, you've got central governments, and then you've got individual critical infrastructure sectors. So it's a really economy-wide and society-wide initiative. So that's the challenge. And then as development agencies, when we're working with governments to help them work on this, we've got to have that broad view in mind. So there's limited resources, both skills and human resources. There's limited political will in many cases, and then there's limited financial resources as well. So it's a question of prioritizing across that landscape in a way which is appropriate for the country that we're dealing with. The countries are, different stages of development. You've got different levels of digital penetration in organizations and at individual household level. And so you have to have an approach which is tailored to the particular country context. Now, the funding, so that's right. We just, we've been, over the last year or two, we've been setting up a cybersecurity focused trust fund with donors that have been making contributions to that. And that's just going to be launched in the near future. So the next month or two, we're going to hoping to have a launch of that. Now, that will be focused on cybersecurity as a theme. It's not focused only on the digital development bit of the bank. It's available to other parts of the bank as well. And that money, flowing through the trust fund is a way of galvanizing activity around the theme across the organization. So we're hoping, it definitely represents a big step forward in terms of the World Bank's attention on this. And I think also as a reflection of individual donors' interest in it as well. And I'm hoping that's going to give some impetus to the issue across the organization.
And maybe to add on that, Chris?
Yes, please.
You are on mute, so I jumped. So
I have construction behind me, so I'm trying to minimize it.
Great. So just to jump in, to build on that, I think there's an inherent tension with the political will, which was very well described, because usually when I speak to the political level, usually they want to see like short-term advancements, like now, what am I going to do? When's the ribbon cutting? What am I going to see that will support my investment? So I think it's the role of the organizations such as the World Bank and USAID and such to make sure that we don't see what sometimes happens when I go to conferences. Sometimes you see people walking around with huge budgets and just buying, and it ends up being like huge white elephants, like big projects, no one to operate them, no operational concept, no processes, no people to support in the long term. So you really have to start with building the assessment, the local understanding, the local circumstances, the local culture that was mentioned, and then assess the global threats on this specific country, and then going to building the org charts, the responsibility, accountability models, building the human capacity, and then the projects. If you don't do it in this order, you end up in a worse place. It's just a waste of money.
So I'd be interested in other folks on the call's view on this idea of how we can make this more political priority. I mean, one, including in places like Africa and Asia, Latin America, there's been good work with regional organizations there to try to elevate this. For instance, the African Union and OAS and ASEAN and others. But it is a tough slog, and perhaps the COVID crisis and the dependence on these technologies can get people to look at it as a priority. Maybe the fact that so many countries are now focused on a development digital agenda, it's not necessarily a cybersecurity agenda, but a digital agenda, will be an entree. But are there any ideas of how we can elevate this issue so it's no longer sort of the poor stepsister, but one of the prime things that people think about when they think about development in this area? And I'll open that to anyone who wants to chime in.
No, so I'll jump in. I mean, we would love to frame our work in digital transformation terms or something like this, and rather than cybersecurity. Because again, when you think about infrastructure projects or government services, you and I know that there is a lot of cybersecurity risks. I'm not talking about threats, but just things will crash and stop working. So in this way, you can, in my opinion, get a better response that we are simply working with you to get the things that you want done and to make sure that they will be more resilient to all the changes that you need. When we discuss cybersecurity, usually you get either kicked to the CIO or IT guy in the West at least, or to the defense or law enforcement sector, and this is absolutely not the intention. Of course, there's definite need there, but this is not what we are up to in our work from the university perspective, of course, and I suppose also from the development point of view. We are trying to improve basic services and not some exquisite defense capabilities or something like this.
I would add that there are two sides to this, and it's like this everywhere. Again, it's pretty straightforward. The one is the reasoning. The second one is the scaring, right? So reasoning is, guys, why do we need to wait for something bad to happen? If you are building infrastructure, physical infrastructure, a building, a tower, a road, you have architects, you have everyone in place, all these engineers. It's just part of everything we do today. Cybersecurity has to be designed. It has to be secure by design. And that takes time for this language to sink in. With that, you also have to present the risks and the losses. When you put these losses in the face, when you show after a very short assessment on your local landscape what your costs were, okay? So the bank in Bangladesh, the Banco de Chile that was hacked, how much did that cost? How much does cybercrime cost? 1 trillion last year. Oh my God, that is more than GDP of many countries that I know. So when you show these two together, I think it starts to sink in that it just needs to be part of how we operate today in governments.
Or does it undermine the trust in your economy so that if you want foreign investment, that having better cybersecurity would help draw that foreign investment in, so that could be an incentive? Any other thoughts on this? I'll note that we have lots of questions in the Q&A, and I'm sure people want to raise their hands too. So I think we're going to move on to that shortly. But any other thoughts about how we can address this issue? All right, well, why don't we start moving on to the questions and answers? I make one other point before we do, which is, you know, this is not just a government development issue, which is an important one to be sure. But there are also private sector and others who have gotten into the game, but not many. I mean, some good ones to be sure, and some of the foundations. There was a letter recently on cyber philanthropy, saying, you know, encouraging many organizations. I think 30 signed a letter saying that we need more cyber philanthropy, including from high tech firms that can start donating to this. And so, you know, as we think about this, that private aspect, I think, is something that has not been tapped enough either, and we should look at.
Chris, could I jump in there for
Yeah.
just a quick second? You know, maybe not the level of philanthropy you're thinking, but, you know, I'd like to call out maybe some of USAID's partners in this regard. So we do a lot of our work from the ground up. And so what we have is some really powerful cooperative agreements with U.S. industry associations. You know, two in particular that I can think are the United States Energy Association and the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. So we get member U.S. utilities and member U.S. state regulatory associations that are volunteering time. And they're building practitioner to practitioner level relationships around the world. They're sending U.S. experts out to the field and of almost at organizational cost to work with counterparts and elevate them globally. So maybe not the level of philanthropy you're thinking, but I still think that is in many ways where it starts in terms of building that culture and building that collaboration and information sharing that not only benefits our partner countries, right, but is benefiting us back here because we're seeing firsthand some of the issues that maybe, you know, the engineers and technicians back in the West have forgotten how to deal with, just as the systems have become more advanced. So I'll pause with that.
And as I mentioned, there's certainly, you know, the Gates Foundation, Hewlett, the Hewlett Foundation, Newmark, Microsoft. There are some who have been very active, and I think just getting more into the game is helpful. Josh, how should we do it? There's so many questions in the Q&A. Is there any particular way we should go through these?
I'm gonna let you. You can see the questions, Chris. I'm gonna let you, as the moderator, kind of go for it.
Great. Well, there's lots of good questions. One question I think that we've touched on a little bit is how donors and implementers can better coordinate with one another in providing cybersecurity building support in the same country or region, given different methods and modalities each may offer. And I'll just say that in part, that's one of the things that my organization, the GFC, is set up to try to do, to bring those different communities together. But I'm sure that also happens on the ground in the World Bank and the USAID and others. So anyone want to take that and chat about it?
I can start and maybe turn it over to Mark if he has something to add. I'd say, you know, at AID, when we're developing assistance programs, we go through broad collaboration. We engage with the other stakeholders in the country. We speak to the other local donors and so on. Our on the ground cooperation between field units is I think quite good. I think where it gets mucked up is when folks like myself sitting back in headquarters decide that we want to do something. And then, you know, though I sit next to my colleagues in the World Bank a few blocks away, we don't talk as well as people who are sitting, you know, 4,000 miles away, like on the ground. So there is that intent. But, you know, the hard part is with cyber becoming in many ways and a much more a prevalent issue. It's become, pardon the term, almost sexy in some circles, right? And so the thing that we run into is an overgeneralization of the topic. Or a misunderstanding of all the nuances, and it makes it hard to separate lanes sometimes. If one organization claims a certain area, there's you can have multiple cooks in the same kitchen, right? To use an analogy, right? So because as long as you're not working on the soup, as long as one's got the salad, one's got the soup, one's got the entree, and so on. And so, anyways, I'll leave it at that.
Someone asked about the letter I mentioned. That can be found at cyberphilanthropy.org. Another question, which I think is really an important one, which is development agencies have lots of data about their partner countries and their projects, and it's essential really to make sure that we're doing this right. Is there a way, or maybe this already exists, to share data among those development agencies and even outside those development agencies so that we can be smarter about how we apply relatively limited resources in this area? Again,
maybe I'll jump in.
Yeah,
maybe I'll jump in. I wrote this piece not long ago about the cyber WHO. And it goes back to exactly, I think, if I understood the question, there's a need to share a lot of information that is out there between the countries that know and bodies and agencies that know and the agencies that do not know and the countries that do not know what to do first. What are the threats? What's the global assessments? What's my local, like in my area? What is cybercrime doing, et cetera, et cetera. And this also goes to the question, the previous question. I think that it's not only about, okay, how are we going to give money and how are we going to share information and how are we going to build all these capacities? I always try to look for some kind of incentive. How do I incentivize on a global scale countries to build cyber capacity? And let's leave aside where the money comes from, donors or your own economy is strong enough to build your cyber capacity, cyber infrastructure. How do you incentivize? So after a while, a decade from now, we understand who really used the money in the best way and has a clean or secure digital landscape. And that goes to another issue of cyber rating. Of just imagine if we would have something like a Standard and Poor rating that would be affected by how you invest your money. When you get from a donor, you get the money, where was it invested? Did you really lead the project in the long term, or did you throw away the money? So then donors and countries both are incentivized to give money to places that really use the money for this good cause of building cyber capacity on a national scale in a responsible way. I think that's something that we need to somehow think to push forward this WHO, the cyber WHO.
Certainly any comments on that are welcome. We have another question to the donors on the panel. To what extent do your organizations have a formal structured cybersecurity risk assessment for every project with an ICT component? So obviously there are lots of, we discussed, projects are not cybersecurity projects per se. The question is, do you build a risk assessment, cybersecurity risk assessment into those, or is that a work in progress?
I'll jump in there. So it's a great question, and one that we've, as an organization, have asked ourselves in recent years about how systematic are we in assessing the cyber risk associated with our projects? And I think the answer we've come to as an organization is there's still significant room to improve there. So we're actually actively working on that right now to integrate cyber risk assessments and cyber evaluation into all projects, all sectoral projects with a digital angle to it. So this would be obviously digital projects, but all other projects that has a digital component. And we're going to be rolling that out across the organization, in due course once we've finalized it.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, just add to that. Yeah, it definitely does need improvement. It's something we've been talking about internally. We have various assessments we do for the respective projects, but writ large, I think the need to consider cyber elements of a lot of our programs, and not just ICT, right? Beyond that, I can give a simple example of I'm speccing out a lot of hardware for electric utilities as part of the donor work I do. Right, it's ensuring that we've got right cyber components in that. All right. Otherwise, we're just going to the lowest bidder with the cheapest comms technology, right? Which then makes it eminently hackable, and we're doing the exact opposite of our development agenda, right? So, just more work to be done in that space, definitely.
The question that how is the debate on cybersecurity issues in the development agenda? Is it changing or with the acceleration of digital transformation of governments, and especially relating to digital identities, governance of personal data, privacy, et cetera? Is that helping to drive this? And I'd add to that, how can you bring that kind of, innovation, digital development agenda that many governments have together with that cybersecurity agenda? Those are often different communities.
First of all, COVID did a great contribute to that. I mean, we saw that in the last year. We had several projects that got stuck before the COVID, and once the COVID started, we saw a great push behind of that, because we saw that the people are running towards the digital and becoming more and more effective online, and all of a sudden the government started to lose control. And we realized now in the first quarter of 2021 how many governments that we've dealt in the past are now asking to get more and more control, or increasing the level of security over there, because they are feeling unsecure. So we saw that there is a big push for that.
Someone else asked how broad we should be in terms of when we think about cybersecurity. That there's been a lot of work in upskilling as part of various initiatives, but there's a thought that maybe that needs to be broadened to include critical thinking and how to deal with disinformation. Disinformation is obviously one of the big things that people are dealing with. Should that be incorporated in this larger agenda, or is that really a different issue?
It's part of cyberspace. It's just been, it's been there for many years, just came from, other types of warfare, like psychological warfare, but it's been embedded because information became digital. So disinformation and perception defense is a big part of what I see as an example. When you want to defend the election process, it's not only about defending the election infrastructure, it's about defending the perception of what's going on. So it's two separate campaigns that you need campaign leaders, two separate campaign leaders to lead these two separate efforts. So I think these things have converged, and it is a part of what we see in cyberspace and cyberspace projects, and defending and helping governments defend the governance system, whatever it is, on a global scale.
Any others want to comment on that? One of our other listeners asks, are there specific focus groups and sectors that attract the most attention in terms of cybersecurity capacity building now in Africa? Is it more of a government priority, citizens writ large? Are there particular sectors that are involved? I note that I've seen a lot of activity around the financial sector in Africa as one of the major projects I've seen, but I'm sure there are others too. Any comments from folks? And again, I'll open this to all.
Yeah, I think the financial sector obviously has had a head start on this, but I think healthcare, as with the recent of the last year, healthcare has as the focus of cyber within healthcare has become much greater. And if we think about the way digital applications are being used around COVID vaccinations and tracking patients and all the rest of it, it raises a whole new set of cyber risks. Now, with the rush to implement those applications, those programs in developing countries, it's raised the attention of cyber in that sector. And I think it's going to propagate into other sectors from there as well.
Sure. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, just from projects that I saw in Africa, I can say that both in Nigeria and Ghana, the two main issues that we worked on were governance models, like the org charts, the national level org charts, who's going to be responsible for what. And the second thing is actually, it goes back to what you spoke about, Lior spoke about the risk assessment and compliance management, but how do you scale that on a national level? I think that's where private sector and the donor organizations have to work together in order to bring governments scalable ways to scale risk assessment and compliance management. It's not easy enough, not good enough, and it's the core of any government's capability to build and assimilate the culture, the secure culture, whatever it is in whatever body in the government. And it's different in every one of them, in critical infrastructure, in the regulators. So scaling that on a national level is a huge issue. And I see that also coming from the countries we worked in.
Right. By the way, I would note for listeners, participants, that there are a number of things that are being posted in the Q&A in terms of some resources, USAID, some other ones that are out there. I mentioned a couple myself. So check those out if certainly if you have a chance. There are a number of other questions. I know we're going to go long, but maybe I'll ask Lior, let me ask one question that's been directed specifically at you, which is, what does your model say that folks should not do? Could you briefly give examples of what your model might tell folks not to do?
I'll give you a consultant's answer. Yeah. Further work needed, but it really depends on what you're trying to do and what the conditions are. Let's go a little bit to a different area of defense assessments or net assessment in general. Right? So let's say you have two forces. One is very strong on maritime capabilities, and another is very strong on the air. So you can go to the one that is weaker on the air and logically, quote unquote, say, well, you got to build a stronger air capacity. The opposite approach, which is sometimes more interesting, is to say, look, don't go compete in this area. There are reasons why you're weak in this area. Leave it alone. You can compensate for this weakness by investing more in this other area. So this would be the typical answer in our assessments, because we're not giving a single score. We are giving at least 20 different areas and domains with the scores provided. And we do not integrate them into a single score for any comparison purposes or something like this. So the answer depends on the goal you're trying to achieve. And for example, some things you can compensate for with more modern automated technologies. Other things that are more organizational recommendations. Then, of course, there is no business whatsoever for buying technological solutions. That's a different type of work. So it greatly depends on the cost. What we will not do is to bring you a book of standards and checkboxes and tell you, okay, you got to go through all of them, reach level 2, then come back talk to us. That's not a constructive approach. Certainly not in this use case.
Let me just revert to one of the questions I want to ask all the panelists, which is, how do you make this? How do you build cybersecurity capacity building in a sustainable way? We used to joke a little bit when I was at the State Department that sometimes it felt like several different countries were training the same 4 guys in the country, 4 guys or women in the country, and then after that there was no checking in on them. There was no, kind of long-term plan that you train people and they would go away. Is there a way, is there a method, and I'm sure this has been dealt with in the larger development agenda, to make sure this is sustainable? And maybe Mark and maybe I'll start with you, because I'm sure this, and Steve, I'm sure this is something.
I would offer a thought. I'm sure you're used to panel conversations where all the panelists say, I've got the answer to every question. I'll tell you, hey, when you figure that one out, please let me know, right? It's an ongoing issue in donor programs, the brain drain. You train folks up, especially in sectors of high demand and high compensation like this. There's always the risk they're going to leave. We try to structure, well at AID, we have workforce development programs. I would say we try to marry those actually with organizational building as well, because what we try to do with the organizations we're working with, at least again, I'm speaking to my programming here, is to make sure there's pathways for people within those organizations. Right. So it's not, you're not just building the workforce per se, but you're also building the internal demand and a place for the workforce within the respective country. Right. So that there is not always necessarily the draw, since I work in Europe, to leave to Germany or Central Europe or other locations for higher paying jobs.
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue which is it's not peculiar to cyber. There are other sectors where exactly the same issue applies. Actually, and that's true of several other things we've been discussing today. On the sustainability point, I mean, a lot of this boils down to what's the prioritization that the country internally, how high a priority do they see this? And as long as it's a priority which is imposed on from the outside through the donors, then you're always going to have this problem of sustainability. But once countries begin to internalize the importance of the issue, then budgets start to follow that, and you find that the financial sustainability of this type of skill, of these type of activities is improved, because the governments are integrating it into their budget planning and providing the resources. And so I think it goes back to the point made earlier, which is if you're in the energy sector, we shouldn't be thinking of transmission, investment and operation and maintenance and cybersecurity is two different things. These are part of the same thing. Cyber is an integral part of, maintaining and operating and upgrading an electricity transmission system. And the same thing applies in healthcare, financial services, and so on and so on and so on. And I think once, we need to work hard on shifting that mentality, and then the sustainability follows from that.
So perhaps
I think it's all.
Go ahead.
I think it. It boils down to what we spoke before about political will. Just think for a second, okay? When countries and governments want to change reality, what do they do? They have budget. Who's going to be responsible for a budget? A minister for something, okay? So we build ministries and we build bodies in governments in order to push forward an agenda. Now, cyberspace, or defending the digital landscape, I think Lior was very correct in saying this. It's not about cybersecurity. It's about building the digital landscape in all these various areas in the right way, in a secure way. So, but now in the phase we are in, because we're only in the second decade, really, of building this really unique man-made domain, we need someone to lead on a national scale. So a minister for whatever name you want to give it, cool and sexy, as Steve said, you need someone to pull and push this forward in all agencies, to be the national coordinator, to be responsible to build in the long term the cyber ecosystem that was discussed. Then when you have that champion that starts building and pushing and building the human resource and all these long-term things that we spoke about, then you can start dissolving this special minister for this very unique and special realm that has been chasing us and biting us in places that we don't want to talk about here. It's just too fast, and you have to act fast, and governments are not fast. So let's be fast.
So a flip side to that is you also have to mainstream it as a high level policy issue too in government. So one thing, that there was something called the Global Conference on Cyberspace. It was started in the UK. But when the Dutch hosted this in 2015, that's when my organization was sort of born in that. One of the goals of that conference was not to bring the ICT ministers in, who were lovely people. They wanted to come too, but the ministers of foreign affairs and the ministers of interior. And so this would raise it in terms of the consciousness of these people who don't deal cyber every day and make it more of a political issue. And I think more of that probably would be welcome to try to get this more on that level of agenda. You know, people who deal with it every day deal with it every day. They're already the converted, so you have to move beyond that. Well, there's lots of great questions, and we've run out of time. But what I'm going to ask each of the panelists to do is just maybe give just a minute sum up of anything that they wanted to mention that they haven't mentioned before, or they want to reiterate. Roy, let's start with you. And please be very brief, because we're already 10 minutes over time, and I think we can only go 15 minutes over time. So Roy, just a quick sum of anything you want to add that you haven't had a chance to mention before.
Reading the questions and the discussion over here, it's an amazing session. I think that we only managed to put a small spotlight on the opportunities and what is out there and things that we can do. I really want to thank everybody for joining, and we'll be more than happy to see how we can contribute in the future to the team, the panel itself, and of course the participants, the crowd. And we'll be more than happy to work together and to see how we can actually push cyber, the ecosystem, and to take it one step forward to make it a better place, a safer place.
Right. Yaron?
Yeah, thank you to everyone. Really great. And thank you, Chris, for moderating this. I think that, you know, this game, it's a global game. And in this global game, what I would really encourage is to look around and build alliances. We need global alliances in this space, no matter how you call them and whatever you want to do. It's about collaborative defense. It's about building capacities in the many ways that we spoke about. And if there are two areas that I would, or three areas that I would start with, I would start with roles and responsibility. Who's going to be responsible? Whose head is going to fly off if things don't work? That's the first thing. The second thing is the human resource and investing in the long term. And maybe the third issue is to start very quickly scaling critical infrastructure, regulator and regulated private sector, create this public-private sector collaboration in order to scale quickly on a national scale.
Great. Lior?
That's it. Thank you.
Right. So yeah, we just barely touched the topic. Obviously, things will be published later. One thing, our organization is perhaps more famous for the conference that we run, the Cyber Week, each summer in July, bar last year. So in July, we're running it again. We're definitely going to have discussions on this. Look it up and feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Steve.
Thank you. Thanks to the other panelists and the attendees. It was a great time. This is just the beginning, right? It's a digital world. It's interconnected. I think Yaron said it. Governments are slow moving. We can't do it, right? Donors can do it. We can start. We can get processes in place, but it's going to take a collective effort, and it's necessary because we're all connected.
And Mark.
Yeah, just one thing we haven't really talked about much, which is the interaction of the role of the private sector in all of this. It's as we've said, the fellow panelists have said, it's very fast moving, and the private sector's able to, to be a valuable partner in this discussion with governments because they're on top of the latest technology and the latest trends.
Great. Well, thank you all, and I agree with that. I think this is not just a government role; it's a private sector role. For those on the call who are donors or potential donors, I encourage you to jump in with both feet into this area. You're much needed, you're much desired, and you're much appreciated. And for those who are implementers, the same thing. Speaking from my own organization, this is something we obviously feel strongly about. This is the whole reason we were created. And working with all the entities on the call here today and many who were participating. And just point to two resources. I mentioned the website, the gfc.org, but also we have a portal that has now over 600 different best practices, other items from around the world in capacity building. That's Cybil Portal, CYBIL portal.org. Thank you again for your attention. I hope that this is going to accelerate. We're kind of still in the beginning of the road. We've had some progress, but this is something where I really think this is going to be the thing that is foundational to all the other progress we're going to make. So thank you again, and I encourage your continued participation. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.